Good evening, everybody. Hello, my name is Dan Boron. I'm the community planner for the City of Springboro, and I also serve as staff liaison to the city's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Before we get into tonight's introduction of our speaker, I want to thank Joe McKenzie and also Maureen Russell Hudson for putting together tonight's live broadcast here on bike planning and the law. Before I go into the presentation introduction of our speaker, just want to let everybody know they can find out all about our events at bikingintheborough.com. Again, www.bikingintheborough.com. Right now I'd like to introduce Steve Magus, who is known as Ohio's bike lawyer. Steve is with his firm, the Magus Law Firm, based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Steve has been in practice for over 30 years and on his own as an attorney representing bicycle clients in injuries and other cases for the past 25 years. In addition to that, Steve is a member of the Ohio Bicycle Federation Board, and Steve also investigates every bicycle fatality in the state of Ohio to get a better understanding of bicycle fatalities, accidents, and other information. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Magus.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. I wish we had a loud, raucous crowd here, but we'll have to go under the assumption that everyone's being loud and raucous wherever you are sitting and watching this. My name is Steve Magus. Dan's description of my practice of more than 30 years as being very generous. I did the math the other day. I came out of law school in 1982, so we're pushing 39 years now. And in those 39 years, I've done mostly personal injury cases, insurance cases, wrongful death cases, usually from the plaintiff's or the victim side. But I've also spent time with an insurance company in-house and with a insurance defense firm doing the same type of work from the opposite side, defending people who are sued in injury and death cases. So I've done thousands of injury and death cases, but my interest was piqued into the bicycle world very early on, and I've done now, from a start of a couple cases back in the 80s, I've done almost 500 bicycle cases, mostly in the state of Ohio, but also in other jurisdictions. If you'll see the OhioBikeLawyer.com website and my number 484-BIKE. I'm always happy to talk bikes, so you can feel free to reach out free of charge to whoever wants them. Send me an email, bikelawyer@me.com. So what we're going to talk today about is the law of riding a bike and what you should think about when you start to get on your bike. You know, it's spring, the weather's nice. The weather was great in March in Ohio. It has kind of not been so great in May so far, but we're working on it. And so tonight, we're going to talk about the law of riding a bicycle. And if you're like most people, you're going, what? There's laws that govern riding a bicycle? Well, we're talking basically about riding a bicycle on the roadway, not on the sidewalk or the tree lawn or the bike trail. There's a whole different set of rules for that. And depending on where we go here tonight, we may talk about some of that. So the main point that I always like to start with is the basic, cycling in Ohio is very safe. I was a math major as an undergraduate. I love the statistical side of cycling. I love to find out how many people are riding, how many crashes are we having, what's going on the roads. And when this was studied a couple of years ago, it was indicated that about 12.5% of Americans cycled on a regular basis. So that was around 47 million people in 2017. For Ohio, that translates out of 12.5% of Ohio's 11.7 million people. It's almost 1.5 million people in Ohio who ride a bike on a regular basis. So that's a lot of people. So let me ask you this. How many people of those 1.5 million who ride their bikes in Ohio regularly, how many of them do you think crash every year? And how many of them do you think are injured or killed every year? What do you think about the crash statistics? And I can tell you, in Ohio, we have millions of riders. We have about 1,500 crashes each year. And that's, when you look at Ohio, it's the 7th largest state in the country. when we look at and compare Ohio to all the other 50 states, we are way down below the average, let alone near the top in these kind of categories. Ohio averages around 16 or 17 fatalities of cyclists who are killed on the road. We're shooting for 0. That's the goal, vision 0. No deaths, no cycling deaths, no pedestrian deaths, no traffic deaths. The cycling and pedestrian is one where we are really trying to decrease our numbers. But Ohio remains one of the safest states. How does that compare to people driving around in their cars? Well, Ohio motorists are going to hit other cars about 300,000 times this year. It's going to be about 500,000 people in Ohio who are involved in car versus car crashes versus about 1,500 of the million plus cyclists who are involved in a car versus bicycle crash. And Ohioans, unfortunately, we're going to lose about 1,000 people to fatal car crashes, about 3 every day in Ohio. So car versus car crashes are a big problem. Car versus bike crashes are a problem, but they're on a much smaller level than you might think when you think about cars and bikes interacting on the road. So what kind of statistical trending are we doing? When you look back, the worst year for cycling in the United States was 1975. In 1970s, we averaged in the United States about 832 fatal crashes each year. And each decade, from the 70s to the 80s, we had a drop, a significant drop. From the 80s to the 90s, a significant drop. 90s in the first 2000 decade, we had a significant drop. And then something changed. Deaths of both cyclists and pedestrians have been heading up, while the car people encased in steel, those numbers are going down a bit. The deaths and injuries to the most vulnerable people on the roads. So what else was going on in our culture around 2008 and 2009? Well, the iPhone was released in the middle of 2007, and then the next version was released in the middle of 2008, and suddenly you could drive around with this little thing in your car, and you could talk on it, and you could take pictures of things. And then the other thing that happened during this time frame is that this Facebook thing took over for the MySpace thing, and it went from a bar graph of this big to the point where it is now billions of people every day are saying, hey, look at me, watch me drive, click, click, click. Oh, look over there's a deer while I'm driving, click, click, click. Same thing with Instagram and all the other social media posts. So I think there's an entire master's thesis ready to be written on why people aren't crashing and killing each other in cars, but they are crashing and killing cyclists and pedestrians in higher numbers. In New York City a little while ago, Memorial Day, there were thousands of cyclists around the city. There was a car race on the city streets in New York, sponsored by Cosmopolitan magazine, of all things. And they were having a car race, and Henry Wells was in the car race, and he's driving his car, and he loses control, and he runs into Evelyn Thomas's vehicle. Evelyn breaks her leg. Henry is arrested and hauled off to jail. You know, it's just another Monday in New York. But as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, this crash happened Memorial Day, 1896. This was the first recorded car crash in U.S. history, and Evelyn was driving a Columbia bicycle. And that was the state of the art at the time in 1896. And Evelyn was one of millions of women who became cycling fanatics as well, because prior to the development of this type of bike that Evelyn had, which looks a lot like the bikes we have today, 2 wheels, same size, it's got handlebars, it's got a brake, it's got pedals, it's got a chain. You know, other than that, everything else that we've done in the last 100 years or so is sort of making things lighter and faster and sleeker, but the same basic design sets up. And women were smart. They watched men on those big penny farthing things with the giant front wheels and the tiny little wheels, and those things were dangerous. People crashed all the time. Once the safety bike came out, women bought into cycling in a big way, and cycling had a huge impact on society, on music, on the dress code, and what was acceptable in dressing And the New York Times ran stories daily about the cycling community, cycling society. Evelyn's crash made it into the New York Times as well. To the devotees of terrestrial flight in its most exhilarating form. And I thought that was a great description of riding a bike. In these early bike law cases, bike advocates and bike lawyers argued the same things that we argue in court today. We argue about your right to use the road, the fact that you have the right to get on your bike and drive your bike like any other vehicle along the roadway. Where on the roadway do you have to be? What are the rules when you come into contact with other vehicles? How does that, what happens when somebody gets hurt or somebody dodges you and hits something else, or you run into a pothole that shouldn't be there? Clemenson analyzed all these cases and then also organized the book into chapters, much like I would write one today if I was writing a book on bicycle law. The same issues that he was arguing, we're still arguing. There were a lot of scofflaw cyclists back in the day, as there are some today, but not in the early cyclists. They were called Scorchers, and the Scorchers were cyclists who would just ride fast, ride hard, ride through town, and not really worry about who they knocked over or what kind of damage they caused. And these people were arrested frequently by the police. They made their way into the New York Times because every day the Times would publish the criminal reports. But by and large, though, cyclists had a very good thing going in that late 1800s time frame. Men and women organized into cycling clubs. The League of American Wheelmen was formed in 1880, and the women's clubs were formed all over the country. We were big in the newspapers, big in the media. It was the thing to do. It was like the big thing was to talk about bike stuff and use cycling language and have cycling events. And that was that late 1890s time frame. And why do we think that was? What was so popular? What made cycling so popular? And I can tell you, it's one word. Cycling is fun. When you really get down to it, you get on a bike and you have fun. And it's a thing that people become passionate about, whether you're kids or adults. Cycling is fun. You get on the bike when you're 5 or 6, and if you're smart, you don't stop riding well into your older age. But it's still fun. And people develop this passion for cycling in that early time frame. So what happened? Well, the car happened. Early into the 20th century, the car started taking over the roads, and congestion started taking over the city streets. And this was in a magazine long ago that predicted the future, and it predicted layers of transportation and people housed together in these congested cities. Car crashes became commonplace. By 1895, Teddy Roosevelt, who was at that point the police commissioner in New York City, the scorching got so bad that he developed the Scorcher squad, a squad of bicycle cops, the first bike cop squad in the country, devoted to taking down scorching cyclists as well as reckless motorcycles, bicyclists, horse and buggy riders, and all of that. So that's one thing that happened to sort of drive the bicycles off the road, was the development of the automobile. Another thing was sort of a concentrated effort by the car people to take over the streets. You think about it, for the first couple thousand years that we were around, we walked around the streets, and then the bicycle came along, and the horse and buggy came along pretty quickly, and they were kind of running through the streets, but we still had people using the roads. And then the bicycle came along, and they started riding on the roads, sharing with the horses and the buggies, but the people still took over the roads. And in the 1930s to 40s, this idea of jaywalking was developed by the car manufacturers and the car people and the AAA. And this wasn't something that somebody just came up with and spouted it out and it became popular. This was a concentrated marketing effort to kick you and me off of the roads as pedestrians, and they don't want you on the road anymore. And so they designed this word J, which was a J was a rube, as a bumpkin. It was it's just somebody who wasn't very smart, wasn't very intelligent, and if you were walking on the roads, that's how they wanted to portray you, as a J, a rube, somebody who just shouldn't be there. And these images that they created, were designed to paint this image, and it worked. I mean, people quit riding bikes, cars took over the roads, and the bike boom of the late 1800s stopped in the early 1900s, and that didn't pick back up again until Mr. Schwinn made a comeback in the 60s. And the second and third bike booms, I count this kind of 60s, 70s as the second bike boom, and the third bike boom we're sort of in right now. In the 60s, there was a decade where bike sales went through the roof, and the Schwinn Varsity, the Schwinn Continental, which I had, the Schwinn bikes really were the driving force there, because it got kids on lighter weight, faster, 10-speed racing style bikes for the first time, at least in the United States. And the bike sales started to outpace car sales back in the 60s as well. Bike commuting blew up in a big way. Now, it's still a small percentage, but when you go from 0 to 1 or 2%, that's a big jump in some areas of the country. Particularly in bigger cities, bicycle commuting became much easier to deal with than getting in a car in New York City, leaving your house, driving into the city, finding a $100 a day place to park, and then trying to make enough money to pay for your car habit. So bicycling in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, big cities and small now, became much more popular since the 60s and 70s. I've seen a 60% increase just in the past decade, but the people that are really driving a lot of these bike purchases are, I guess, old people like me. I'll be 64 next week. I was one of those kids who got the Schwinn Continental in the 70s and never quit riding, and there's a whole generation of baby boomers who are riding. Now I have, we're going to talk about in a minute, I have a regular bike, and I have my e-bike, because my bad knees don't let me climb the hills as much as I would like, but I still want to get out and ride. So we're going to talk about e-bikes here in a minute. The basics, if you take nothing away tonight, cycling in Ohio is safe on the roads. Most of the time, you go out, you have a good time, you come back. Every once in a great while, something weird will happen, but those are the shipwrecks. And unfortunately, the shipwrecks get reported much more than the millions of people that ride safely every day. But statistically, Ohio continues to be one of the safest states in the country for riding a bike. So what are you going to do? You're going to get on your bike and you're going to go on the road and ride. You want to follow the law of riding a bike in Ohio and stay safe. What's the basic premise of the bike law? Well, the mantra that we chant over and over: same rights, same roads, same rights, same rules. That is the key mantra. You drive your bike like you drive your car. A bike is this sort of hybrid vehicle. You can ride a bike on the road, you can ride it on the berm, you can ride it on the tree lawn, you can ride it through the ditches and the fields, on the sidewalks. So you can't do that with any other vehicle that's covered by the vehicular code. But the code says once you cross the white line, once you cross the fog line and you're on the road, you're to drive your bike like you drive your car. You stay in the lane that you're supposed to be in as you would with a car. And there's a few special rules that we're going to talk about, one of which is AFRAP, A-F-R-A-P. And that's a goofy rule, AFRAP. It means as far right as practicable. And it comes from the code section in Ohio law 4511.55a. Every person operating a bicycle on the roadway shall ride as near to the right side of the roadway as practicable, obeying all traffic rules applicable to vehicles and exercising due care when passing a standing vehicle or one proceeding in the same direction. The second half of that is sort of what we have to do anyway. The first half is a unique rule for cycling. It says, as near to the right side of the roadway as practicable. Unfortunately, the Ohio legislature, in its infinite wisdom, decided that defining this word practicable was not something it wanted to do. And so for the first 40 or 50 years that law was in effect, we didn't have a definition of it. In 2006, the Ohio Bicycle Federation developed a package of legal reforms. We called it the Better Bicycling Bill. We found some sponsors, we got it passed, and we amended a dozen or more bicycle law code sections, and in 451155 we added an exception to this rule of riding as to the right, far right as practicable, and we tried to put some definitional teeth into the rule, as we'll see in a minute here. So where can you ride? You ride as near to the right side of the road as practicable. There's a case State versus Stephen Sells that says that, among other things. The other thing the law says is that you're not allowed to ride more than 2 abreast in a single lane. And the courts have held that that phrase, no more than 2 abreast, means that you can ride 2 abreast in a single lane in any road in the state of Ohio on which you can ride a bike. You and your buddy are allowed to ride side by side on that road. And so for many years I used to argue, well, if 2 people can take up 1 lane, the one person should get half the lane and the other person should get the other half the lane. That seems safe and reasonable. And my argument to courts and the juries was that the legislature, whatever practicable means in terms of how you're supposed to conduct yourself on the road, it has to have elements of reasonableness and safety. The legislature would not tell you to drive your car or drive your bicycle in a manner that was unsafe or unreasonable. So we have to sort of read, whatever that means, we have to read in those elements, and the safety and reasonableness has to be for the cyclist, because the cyclist is the one who's being protected by the law. So what does practicable mean? Well, and we added this C section in 2018, and it says the section does not require a person operating a bicycle to ride at the edge of the roadway when it is unreasonable or unsafe to do so. So we added sort of these vaguer elements, and then we went on to define a few things. Conditions that may require riding away from the edge include when necessary to avoid fixed or moving objects, parked or moving vehicles, surface hazards, if it is otherwise unsafe or impracticable to do so. And then this was our big sort of sneaky 25 words or so that helps everybody. If the lane is too narrow for the bicycle and an overtaking vehicle to travel safely side by side within the lane. This too narrow exception to riding over to the right. If you look at the thousands of miles of roads that you can ride a bike on in Ohio, virtually every mile of every road is too narrow for you to be riding your bike and to have a big pickup or a Humvee or a semi next to you in the same lane. And if it's too narrow, the lane that you're on is too narrow, you don't have to ride over to the right. You can take the lane, which is the language the cycling advocates like to use. Take the lane or use the lane, move over to the left a little bit so you're more visible, more conspicuous, and in a better and safer place to be. So how narrow is too narrow? Well, here's a diagram that shows that a 14-foot lane, which is a big lane. Most lanes in Ohio are 10, 11, 12-foot lanes. A 14-foot lane is too narrow for a semi to share with a bicyclist. And Florida advocate Carrie Cafferty is also a graphic artist, and she created this model, which is to scale, showing the 30 to 40-inch woman on her bike off to the right being passed by the semi, and down at the bottom you see minimum clearance 3 feet, and the semi has to intrude on that 3-foot clearance. The semi cannot pass the bicyclist and give the bicyclist 3 feet without leaving that 14-foot lane. So a 14-foot lane, and anything smaller than 14 foot is too narrow to be shared. What that means to you, if you're going out to ride your bike, you're thinking, all right, well, I got to ride off to the right. Well, yes and no. As long as that lane you're in is 14 foot or less, you do not have to hug the white line and ride on the edge. And it's actually safer for you to not do that for many reasons. From a safety perspective, you want to be in a place on the lane that is conspicuous to other motorists before they get too close to you. When you are riding on the edge, you tend to kind of blend in with the scenery off to the right for the motorist. You tend to be sending a visual cue to the motorist who's coming up to pass you that, hey, maybe it's okay if I get as close as I can to that cyclist without crossing the double yellow or the single line or whatever, the lane line, and if I can just squeeze in there, I'm going to do it. As soon as you move left into the lane, that evaporates. The motorist has to say, boy, there's no way I can do this without leaving the lane. They exit the lane to go around you, and you tend to be passed more safely. So the AFRAP law, I spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's the most important bike law because there's no other vehicle in the vehicle code that gets a special rule trying to tell you what part of the asphalt lane you're supposed to be riding on. In one case, I had a police officer on cross-examination, and I said, sir, where is the magic line of practicability that to the right of which is okay, but to the left of which you're going to give somebody a ticket, for riding? And of course, he fumbled around but didn't have an answer for that. Another thing you have to watch out for if you ride your bike on the road is not only do you have to remember all that stuff you learned in driver's ed for driving your car, what the rules are for stop signs and stoplights and passing and all of that, but you have to understand that there might be local rules in your city that are somewhat slightly different from the state rules. And so, for example, Hamilton County and Cincinnati, there are 48 separate jurisdictions, 48 separate city councils that can pass their own city ordinances that might say something about how you have to ride your bike when you're in the city, or they'll very often say something about things that aren't covered by Ohio law, like how do you ride your bike on the sidewalk, whether you can or not. So you have to check, I say, consult local listings, because the 451107 is the section of the code that allows municipalities to write their own laws. However, it says no such regulation shall prohibit the use of bicycles on any public street. So we managed to get that in. That's actually in the code twice. They can write laws, but they can't say no bikes on this road. If you're allowed to ride on that road in general, they can't kick you off of it. They can also not write laws that are fundamentally inconsistent with state traffic law. Now, if you're sitting at home and you're on Google, you can Google the phrase safe riding regulations for bicycles. And these are what I call the stupid laws. If you Google this phrase, safe riding regulations for bicycles, what you find is dotted all over the state of Ohio, all these little city codes have adopted a page that some idiot wrote in a legal publishing house back in the back room, and he wrote safe riding regulations for bicycles. Let me see here. We don't want them on the road, so if there's a sidewalk, you got to use the sidewalk, and you better get a horn on your bike. And they put all these goofy rules that don't have anything to do with state law, but they wrote them up and they sold these books of laws for everything from zoning to farming to traffic to whatever. They would sell an entire book of laws to the village of West Podunk, and then the West Podunk City Council votes the laws in, and they don't have to sit and write 1,000 pages of laws. They can just take the sheet out and sign off or adapt it a little bit to fit their code. And you find these safe riding regulations for bicycles in a lot of these codes. I wrote a piece on my website about them, your ticket to the stupid laws. What do the stupid laws say? One thing they say, they have a mandatory side path or sidewalk law, so that these stupid laws will say, if you want to ride on a road, that's fine, but if there's a sidewalk next to it, you have to use the sidewalk. So it's basically a ban on using the road. As I told you a minute ago, the state legislature said, hey, you cannot ban bicycles from the roadway. And that's true. And that state law controls over the stupid laws. However, the stupid laws are still enforced. And they're still on the books. And sometimes the police in the smaller jurisdictions don't understand that the stupid laws can't be different from the state law, and so that can create a problem. 4511-711 says, no person shall drive any vehicle other than a bicycle upon a sidewalk or sidewalk area. But this says, nothing in this section shall be construed as prohibiting local authorities from regulating the operation of bicycles, except no local authority may require that bicycles be operated on the sidewalks. Cain versus the City of Dayton was a case that came out a couple of years ago. Mr. Cain was riding his bike. It was about 30 minutes past sunset. So if you remember back to your days in driver's ed, the law says, 30 minutes, all right, if lights on at sunset. That's what our teacher always told us. You got to have your lights on your car at sunset. The same rule should apply to bicycles. Except the City of Dayton, in its infinite wisdom, passed a city ordinance that said, you know what, the cyclists are pretty visible. We're going to give them an hour. So cyclists do not have to turn their lights on for an hour. And this guy is riding in a road in Dayton, and this giant fire engine runs him over. He's in the bike lane. The fire engine's turning into a gas station, and it runs him over. And it's 30 minutes past sunset. So the City of Dayton argues, hey, you know what? This guy didn't have his lights on. Therefore, he was violating the code of the state. Therefore, he didn't have the right of way, and therefore we should win this case where we ran him over. And the kid on the bike says, wait a minute, you guys, you City of Dayton people, you passed a law that said I didn't have to have my lights on until an hour after sunset. So now the city is stuck, and they actually argued successfully to the court that the law that they passed, it's no good. And the fact that he relied on it, too bad. And the court agreed, because the court said the state law controls. And when you have a state law that says lights on at sunset, you can't have a city saying, 15 minutes after sunset's fine. The other one says 30 minutes before sunset, and now you're driving down Springfield Pike going through 14 cities, flipping your lights on and off depending on what time it is when you go through the city. That doesn't make any sense. The same, so even though Mr. Cain lost that case, I can tell you he ended up settling the case because it was clear, he was visible, he should have been seen, he never should have run him over. So bikes can't be banned from Ohio's roads, and even though there are still bike bans, so I guess I screwed up my PowerPoint there. There's still bike bans on the books, and one of them was in the city of Pickerington, Ohio. In the city of Pickerington, Ohio, my client was on his bicycle riding along the right side of the road. He was hit from behind by a 90-year-old motorist, suffered very severe traumatic injuries. And we thought, great, we got a great case until we got the police report, and it says Pickering ordinance has the stupid law that says bikes must be ridden on the sidewalk when the sidewalk is available. Therefore, the cyclist was the one at fault for getting rear-ended by the 90-year-old guy who couldn't see 10 feet ahead of him and ran him over. And sure enough, we look at the ordinance, 44406, you have to ride on the sidewalk rather than the roadway. Well, there were different ways I could have approached this. My approach was to call the city solicitor for the city of Pickerington and say, hey, you ought to read this thing that says you can't write laws that are inconsistent with state law. And we're going to have a big old lawsuit here where we're challenging this, and do you really want to do that? And he said no. And so they ended up revising the crash report to say, even though our city law says that, we feel the city law is invalid. And then we were able to get the motorist blamed for the crash, which took away the defense of the insurance company that, hey, it was your guy's fault, not ours. So consult local listings and read them carefully. So we have a new law on the book now. Like I said, I have an e-bike. That law took effect in 2018. In general, e-bikes are the same as other bikes when it comes to using the roads and driving your bike like you drive your car. There are 3 classes of e-bikes. Class 1, 20 miles an hour, max speed while pedaling. All of these have electric motors, and they have motors that are, I think, 750 watts. And the e-bike law was needed because these things were coming out, people were buying them, and the old law talked about mopeds and motorized bicycles in terms of piston displacement and horsepower. Those are words that don't really apply when you've got an electric motor generating some oomph for the bike. So they split it up into 3 classes. Class 1 will take you 20 miles an hour while pedaling. That's what I have. I've got a motor. I can juice it up in the garage, and when I go out, I can click it on, and it'll help me get up the hills. I can get up to 20 miles an hour while pedaling. A Class 2 bike is a bike that gets you up to 20 miles an hour when you're just sitting there. So it's a little different sort of a bike. It's almost like a little, not a motorcycle, but it's a bike that'll propel you along, but it also chews up the battery pretty quickly. And then the Class 3 bike has more oomph to it. It's got 28 mile an hour top speed, and that's cooking on a bicycle. But you have to be pedaling in order to do that. Generally, Class 1 and 2 bikes are permitted on most bike trails unless the owner of the bike trail says no e-bikes. I haven't run across that anywhere yet. So Class 3, though, are generally not permitted on the roadway. So what about, we talked about the 1895 book that Mr. Burr Clemenson wrote. One of the chapters in here talks about municipal liability, and Ohio has a pretty good hole in the municipal liability for potholes, assuming you can prove the city has notice of road defects and they fail to take the time it takes to fix them. There's a way to work your way through the statute and impose liability on the city. And Mr. Crabtree here was riding his bike. He was riding through an area that was well known by everyone, the city, everybody who lived there, everybody who drove through there, that whenever it rained, this particular part of Columbus, A, would flood this road, B, all the stuff that was on the hills around it would flood into the road, and C, there were potholes in this thing that made it very dangerous for cars, but also for bicyclists. Mr. Crabtree was riding his bike. He had to dodge around a pothole. He got hit by a car, was rendered a quadriplegic. And he sued the car driver that hit him, but that guy doesn't have the money that it takes to compensate someone who's been made a quadriplegic. So he sued the city, and a friend of mine handled this case. It was a very clever approach, and that he lost at the trial court level. And he set the case up very well, appealed to the Court of Appeals for Franklin County, and won a reversal of the decision throwing the case out. The case went back to the trial court, and instead of trying the case, they decided to pay Mr. Crabtree $1.5 million to settle the case. So the issues of potholes are ones that cyclists can also come into. Let's go to this area here. What if you crash? I said in the beginning, the crashes are fairly rare, but they still happen. If you get hit by a car, if you get hit by a dog, you're in some event and something happens. There's a lot of different scenarios where cyclists on the roadway are injured or killed. So what happens if you crash? What sort of things should you think about? What sort of things should you do? What are the rules? How do crashes happen? Well, I can tell you, crashes have been happening in Ohio for a long time. Back in the 30s and 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 10s, 20s, and into the future. We're going to have people driving 2-ton bowling balls in a very careless manner, and they're going to hit other people in steel cages, and they're going to hit people on the sidewalk, people on the roads, cyclists, runners, and when we look at the statistics for why these things happen, we can generally break the crashes into a few categories. For bad motorist behavior, things that motorists do to cause crashes include the right hook. Here, the cyclist is cruising along the right side of the road, and the motorist passes and then tries to make the right turn across the cyclist path. The next big one is the left cross. This is where the motorist is coming towards the cyclist and makes a left turn, doesn't see, quote unquote, the cyclist, makes a left turn either into the cyclist or across the cyclist path. I can tell you, of the 500 cases I've handled, more than half, maybe 2/3 have been one of these two scenarios, probably. Cyclists get pinched off where they are trying to move through the road, and the car it's almost a side swipe, or getting pinched off the roadway, and the rear ender. A left-turning motorist can certainly cause a lot of damage. I mean, this crash was in Brecksville, Ohio. The cyclist had the right-of-way. The motorist said the sun was in his eyes. He made a left turn into this roadway. As you can tell from the picture, he missed the lane he was aiming at by an entire lane. He's turning into the wrong lane. The cyclists were coming towards the truck. He hit the first two cyclists with the front of the truck, and then he stopped, and the next three cyclists in the group hit the side of the truck. He killed the first two cyclists, and the next three were severely injured. So this was a very complex case. I represented the man in the front of the pack there, his family, and the fellow who did the driving was a commercial landscaper who owned his own company, was on the phone texting. He'd had a couple of drinks. I mean, everything bad that you can think of in this case happened. Unfortunately for the riders who were in exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. There's absolutely nothing they could have done. This fellow came towards them, sat at the intersection for a moment. They're thinking, okay, he sees us, and then all of a sudden he's texting, he gets done and goes and causes a bad crash. Dooring is another thing we see quite a bit from motorists, where they open their door into the path. In this particular case, the cyclist was killed. This was a case out of California where the cyclists are required to use the bike lane. And the bike lane here, as you can see in the picture, was painted in the door zone. So when the car opened the door, it knocked the cyclist into traffic that was coming on the highway lane there. Cyclists are not angels, and we do our own stupid things sometimes. There's a lot of dumb or bad or negligent, careless cycling behavior. And one of them can be called sliding up. This is where cars are sitting at a light and Mr. or Mrs. Cyclist slides up to the right. And maybe that's permitted depending on the width of the road, but you have to be careful because that front person in line may be making a right turn and may not even realize that you've slid up next to them. You may be in a blind spot, so the light changes, you start to go, you don't see the right turn signal, and the motorist makes a right turn into you. Salmon riding or riding on the wrong way is still an ongoing problem. People have told me over the years, well, that's how I was taught by my dad, told me to ride because you could jump out of the way of the cars or whatever. No, that's dumb. That's stupid. Don't do that. Ride like you drive your car. Get on the right lane and drive in the appropriate lane. Don't try to ride against traffic. I call this one a failure to see, S-E-E. If you've taken a motorcycle training class, one of the things they teach you when you're driving your motorcycle for traffic strategy is S-E-E. Survey at least 5 to 10 seconds ahead of you. What's going on? Not right in front of you, but several seconds out. Evaluate that situation and then execute a plan early enough so that you're not coming up like this rider at the last minute and then trying to veer away from some hazard. That rider should have seen the hazard way back and done something before they're on top of the hazard to get around it. poor prior planning. This is sort of similar to the C concept, but the rider who is trying to kind of go in and out of the park, in between the parked cars, or jumping off the curb back onto the sidewalk and try to get around the lights. All of those things are dumb, careless things to do and can get you hit by a car. And again, riding in the ZOR zone, you can argue, is just not smart. But it's difficult because in the California case, you're supposed to ride in the bike lane. In Ohio, the law is ride to the right, unless the lane is too narrow, and then you can move over. But if you're riding towards the right, that's what the legislature tells you to do. So you have to be smart and keep your eyes open. So what do bike lawyers do when there's a crash? How do we get involved? What happens? First thing we do is get the bike, and we get the helmet, and we make sure a police report is prepared. And if you're making your checklist, gee, what should I do if I'm in a crash? The first thing you should do is make sure the police get there. What happens, and I can tell you, it happens more for people on a bicycle than it does for when you're in a crash in a car. When you're in a crash on a bicycle, frequently you almost feel embarrassed that you're on the road, you're holding up traffic, and unless you're catastrophically injured, you're kind of trying to figure out what's going on. You may have hit your head, you may be woozy, and it's very easy for the guy who hits you to come up and say, hey, you okay? And you say, yeah, I'm fine, and then off you go without calling the police or making a report. Always call the police, always get a report made. You want to make sure that even if it's your fault, the other guy's fault, doesn't matter. You want to make sure that there is a report made, that a police officer takes the license from the other person, gets the insurance information, gets the address, issues any citations that need to be issued, and you want to make sure you are checked out. I can tell you, if we get this far, I have a video here of a client of mine who was riding his bike in Clifton near the university. He's in a lane, there's a 2-lane road. He's sitting on a hill waiting for a light. Light changes, starts pedaling up the hill, gets under the light, bam, gets hit from behind. And you see him, it's not a huge hit, but you see him go up, he gets down, his head hits the pavement, and then he gets up, he looks back, his bike is under the car, he looks around, he gets up, he walks off the road. People come running out from Chipotle, which is across the street from the hospital, and all these people that come running out are dressed in their scrubs because that's where all the doctors eat. And so he's got a team of doctors around him in 30 seconds telling him, sit down, take it easy, we're going to get somebody here. And he's telling them, I feel fine, I'm okay. And 30 minutes goes by. He gets checked out by the EMTs and all of that, gets home. He looks at the video. He has no memory of the impact, no memory of talking to all these people, no memory of telling everyone he's fine, he wants to get up and go, he's going to ride his bike home, his house isn't far, he'll walk from here. No memory of any of that. And that little smack of the helmet on the pavement knocked him around enough that made his statements unreliable, so to speak, when he was on the scene. And he was lucky he was surrounded by doctors because he could have wandered off anywhere. So make sure you get the police there, follow the EMT instructions. If there is a way for you to gather witnesses, make sure you do that. If you have your phone, you can take photos. Anything before you leave the scene that you can do or have your friends do to figure out what happened, figure out pictures of evidence, skid marks, debris, where the car ended up, what the driver looks like, what his license is, all those things you'd like to do while you're there before you leave, or while your friends are there before they leave, because goofy things happen once everybody goes away. The guy I just told you about with the video, I got a call from the insurance adjuster, and she says, well, my guy said, your guy just came out of nowhere and he couldn't avoid hitting him. And I said, have you seen the video? And she said, what video? And so I sent her the video, and she said, oh, I see. This guy was riding in a straight line up a steep hill for 17 seconds and got hit from behind. So he didn't come out of nowhere, but that's what the other motorist told his insurance company, because the other motorist was trying to get out of paying the money. So get the police there, get a record made. Beware of people that want to change their story after the facts here. So Let me talk for a minute about insurance. A boring topic, I know. If you ride your bike on the road with any frequency at all, there are several things you should think about. Obviously, if you have health insurance, you want to have your card with you when you ride. If you have auto insurance and you ride a lot, you need to think about getting as much uninsured motorist coverage as you think you would need in case you are run over by someone who is underinsured. So if you make a good living and you've got money put away, and if you were not able to work for 6 months, and that would have a tremendous financial impact, and you got hit by somebody who has $25,000 in coverage and nothing else, you want to have enough uninsured motorist coverage, because that will apply to an auto versus bicycle crash. Even though you're not in your car, that insurance will apply to help you. There's a second coverage in your auto policy called medical payments coverage. That's usually a smaller number, $5,000, $10,000. I've had one case with $100,000, and that guy broke his hip, had 2 hip surgeries, and spent $100,000 of his State Farm MedPay. Normally, the medical payments is a smaller number. What is that? MedPay is money that your auto insurer will pay you for your medical bills if you are in a car crash. And you can be sitting on a park bench, a car comes over the curb and hits you, and you can get MedPay. You can be on your bicycle and somebody hits you, and you can get to your auto policies MedPay. Why is that important? Because if you're like me, or a lot of people have high deductible. If I get hit in my bike on the way home here, I've got about a $7,000 out of pocket that I have to come up with, because that's what my deductible is. And the MedPay coverage can help you with the cash flow when all of a sudden you're hit by a car, the bills come in. The other guy's insurance isn't going to pay that. You're on the hook for that until you're all better and you can present a claim and you can settle that claim. And that could be a month, 6 months, a year. I've got cases that are 3 and 4 years old because of one thing or another. The people took a long time to heal. The defendant fought the claim. We had to go to court. We had to go through litigation. So if having that cash flow from your auto policy that you paid for to help cover your medical bills can be very important. Another thing to think about, which is something that I hadn't really thought about until this year, when now I have 3 cases in which this has come up. People that have a lot to lose often carry what's called an umbrella policy. They're generally, an umbrella means if you use up all your other insurance, here's a big pot of money that we'll use to try to settle your case. They generally require you to carry a pretty high limit. So for example, in an auto case, your uninsured motorist coverage would have to be $250,000 or more, but then that company will write you $1 million umbrella. And we'll say for about $150, we'll provide you with this $1 million over here in case you get hurt so bad that your case is worth more than $250,000. You use up that whole big pot of money that you paid for, $250, but you have $1 million case, you can now tap into this umbrella. It's a once-in-a-lifetime sort of a coverage. That's why it's so cheap, because they require you to carry pretty high underlying coverage on your uninsured, so you don't rarely tap into it. Well, I have 3 cases going right now. In one of them, and I found out something new. I found out that insurers are now not automatically writing the umbrella to cover the uninsured motorist. You can buy an umbrella. It's $1 million of liability coverage. If you run over an orthopedic surgeon and that person sues you, you would have your underlying coverage of liability, let's say it's $250,000, and then you'd have this $1 million pot to protect you if you get sued. However, the insurance companies are not automatically applying that to your uninsured motorist coverage. And they don't always tell you that. You have to actually ask for that, and you have to pay a separate little premium. It's just like $150. I have 2 cases, or 2 or 3 cases now, where this has come into play. In one, my client thought he had coverage. For 40 years, he had an umbrella. And the company he was with covered his uninsured motorist. But he got mad at them with the way they handled the case, and he went to the AARP magazine and saw an ad for another company, and he called the 800 number, asked for a quote, got a quote, said, all right, I'm changing, paid the money. 6 weeks later, he's walking in a crosswalk, got hit by a car, has $1 million case, and we're thinking, oh great, he's got an umbrella. Well, they didn't quote him for the uninsured part of the umbrella. He had $1 million. If he had hit somebody, he would be protected for his $250 plus $1 million. But when the person ran over him, he was limited, quote unquote, to his $250. That's a lot of money. But when your medical bills are $300,000, that's not a lot of money. So in that case, it doesn't look like he has $1 million in coverage. I have another case where the motorist ran over my client. My client thought he had $1 million of coverage, and we're now digging into the history of communications over the period of about a decade to see what transpired between the agent and the insurance company and the insured to figure out why he doesn't have $1 million of coverage. So it's a small budget item. It's like $150, $200 to buy this huge pot of money that hopefully you never need to use. But if you're riding your bike on the road and you want to protect yourself, you want to make sure that you have the best possible insurance plan in place. And you should ask your agent, hey, if I get hit on my bike and I have an uninsured motorist claim of $1 million, is this umbrella going to cover me or not? So the other policy that you might have that can come into play that people don't think about is your homeowner's insurance. If your bike, you're riding your $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 custom bicycle that is destroyed by a motorist, your homeowners might give you a better return than the other guy's policy, because your homeowners is typically what they call a replacement cost policy. They want to buy you a new bike, and the other guy has to pay you the value of your bike, which might be depreciated much more. The other place your homeowners can help you is if you get sued by the person that hit you. I've had 2 of those cases in recent years where a motorcycle rider ran into the bicyclist. And as I'm working on getting the bicyclist claim together to send to the motorcycle rider's insurance company, the motorcyclist turned around and sued my guy. And so it's like, well, now what do? You've been sued by this motorcyclist. You don't have auto insurance. That doesn't apply because you're on your bicycle. Turns out your homeowners provides liability coverage over claims that you were negligent, whether somebody slipped and fell in your house, or if you were negligent and somehow caused injury on your bicycle, your homeowners will provide coverage for that and provide a defense. So in both of my cases, somebody representing the motorcyclist sues my guy. We go to my guy's homeowners. They assign a defense lawyer that I'm now working with. I then file a counterclaim against the motorcyclist. He reports it to his insurance company. Now he has a defense lawyer. So now each side has 2 lawyers with 1 client on both sides, and it gets complicated, but you at least are protected from having to bear the defense costs and having to pay the verdict against you if it turns out that you're liable. So I'm at an hour and 2, so go a little further. Is that all right? Or you okay? Whatever you want to do. All right. So who are possible people that you might go after in these cases, so to speak? Who has liability to you? The motorist, obviously, that runs you over, the dog owner of the dog that slams into you, a municipality can be liable if the municipality allows roads to be maintained in a very bad condition, and even an event that you're riding in, even if you sign a waiver sometimes, you might be able to have a claim against the event, depending on the particular facts and circumstances. For a dog owner, we get into some situations where a tenant has a dog, and there are sometimes we can extend liability to the landlord, but those get a little bit tricky. Let me skip this here. Let me go to here. So what can you do, and where can you find some evidence that might help you? And we'll end with this segment here. First thing is in the police records. In 2006, There were 3 kids riding their bikes on the road, Banning Road, very narrow road, 10-foot lanes, no berm, white line, fog lines on each side. 3 kids are in a row. The first 2 peel off to the left. They cross the road into a field and they're riding, and the third one wants to follow them. However, the defendant's in a car. He comes up from behind and wants to pass the third rider. He sees the first 2 kids go and then decides he's going to pass Tammy Leon, the kid who was killed. And he told the police, I tried to pass the kid. The kid rode the bike to the middle of the street into my path. I swerved, but the kid kept coming. When I hit the kid, I was all the way over in the other lane of traffic. That was his story, was that Tammy had ridden her bike across the path, and he crossed over the center line and hit her way on the other side of the road. That didn't smell right when we started looking at the crash report. And there were 3 bits of evidence. I labeled them on this, if you can see it. I labeled these paint chips as A, B, and C. And the paint chips were right along the fog line that Tammy Leon was riding on to the right. They were as far right as you could possibly be without being in a ditch. That's where these paint chips were. And we had an expert who said that those paint chips fell off the car at impact, and they dropped a little further up because the paint chips are going the same speed as the car. So when the car hit the bike, the paint chips were moving forward and they dropped, but they dropped basically in the line that the car was traveling in at impact. And those 3 paint chips allowed us to argue that this guy was full of crap when he said he hit her on the other side of the road. He hit her on the white line. And the evidence from the car shows that he hit her right at the right headlight, and she slid up and hit the windshield. So we were able to use the paint chips from the scene there, made the case. Other places to find evidence, and I've had clients do this on their own, security cameras. This was a case, it's like, where in the world did he come from? In this case, my client is, if you're looking at the picture, coming up a hill towards the camera, going to make a right turn. And he got hit by a car, and I asked him, where'd the car come from? He had no clue. He had no idea where this car came from. Well, here's an aerial view of the scene. My guy is coming up, under the word camera, is coming up, makes a right turn around the big red brick building. Well, we saw the business next door had some security cameras. And so there they are. And one of them was pointed right to the point where the crash happened. And so hopefully we're able to show the little snippet of video here. But it shows that there is a car parked on the sidewalk going the wrong way on the sidewalk. I mean, not that parking on the sidewalk is ever legal, but this guy's parked facing the wrong direction. He pulls off and they look around, the motorcycle guys take off. Here comes my client, and bang, this guy pulls off the sidewalk and hits my guy. And that's why my guy had no clue. He's like, why would there be a car there? It makes no sense. And that's exactly why. We had another case with a security camera where a big dump truck was hauling a bunch of landscaping debris that was sticking out off the back of the landscaping trailer. Again, a narrow 2-lane road out in the country. The guy passes the cyclist and a branch hits the cyclist on the back of the head and knocks him into the next county. And when we started looking, we found a business about a quarter mile up the road, had a video surveillance. We were able to get the surveillance video, which showed the top image, which is your sort of typical grainy surveillance video. But we checked around the area and we found a landscaper that had a white truck with a black bed and a red trailer, just like the one in the video. We were able to make the case against that landscaper. Sometimes Metro bus have their cameras on. In this case, the bus was sitting at the bus stop, cameras pointing ahead, and captured the crash that happened in the intersection ahead, where we had to do some issue some subpoenas because they don't like to give up the footage, but we're able to get the subpoena issued, get them to preserve the video, and then show that my client was doing everything he was supposed to do when the car made a left turn across his path. This is the video from the helmet of the fellow I talked about a little bit ago. You can see he's sitting on the road. He's going up a steep hill. Traffic goes up. If you do the count, it's about 15 seconds from the time he starts to the time he stops. He gets into the intersection, and then bang. He gets hit, goes down, hits his head, gets up. There's his bike under the car. And from there, he has no memory for the next 30 minutes as to what in the world was going on. Cyclists today ride with phones. They map their rides. They ride with GPS devices and other fancy computers. And all of those things, this phone, even though I'm not using it as a GPS, if I have Auntie Annie's pretzels and I have their app and my phone wants me to stop at Auntie Annie's, it's going to track me with the GPS built into the phone. And when I get close to Auntie Annie's, it's going to ping and tell me, hey, you're near the pretzel stop. Why don't you stop in? Oh, and here's a coupon. Well, in order for your phone to do that, it has to create a GPS file. And that GPS file can be accessed by a forensic electronic person who can go in, pull the file out, and we can see all the data points that your GPS was tracking. So it might tell the speed, it'll tell distance, it might tell if you stopped at a stoplight or not. All these things that can come in handy when things go wrong and there's a car crash. Same with the big GPS points. The crash I talked about earlier with the left turning truck where 2 people were killed. My client had a small Garmin GPS on the front of his bike. The police, unfortunately, didn't understand the Garmin. They presented it improperly at the criminal trial. They didn't want our help. And unfortunately, the driver walked with a not guilty verdict at the criminal trial. When it came time to the civil trial, we had 5 victims, 5 lawyers, and we all banded together. But this GPS data was absolutely critical in proving a number of things. GPS, when you pull out the file, you find that the GPS is sort of taking a picture every couple seconds of where you are, and it records your GPS coordinates, where on the planet Earth you are. It records what direction you're heading, if you're heading east or west, or what degrees on the compass direction you're heading. It records your speed, and it records how far you traveled from the last point. And it sequences 41, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each point tells you how high off the earth you are. So this is at the altitude of like 700 to 800 feet. Tells you how far from the prior point the current point was taken, how many seconds elapsed, and what your speed was. What this showed was that these guys were moving. They were going 33, 34 miles an hour down a hill. As they approached the intersection, he slows to 27 and then to 16 miles an hour. And his directional heading goes from 90 degrees, which is due east, to 94, 98 to 100. So he is pulling his bike to the right as he's slowing down, because our theory was he saw this guy beginning to drive this massive 3-ton truck into his path, and he was doing everything he could to try to get away from it. So the defense, the motorist had argued in a criminal trial, and he had an expert come in and say the cyclists should have realized that he couldn't see them because the sun was at their back. And what we were able to show in the civil case with this GPS data was they probably did see him. They probably knew he was coming, and they were doing everything they could to pull the bike to the right and get out of the way before they got hit. So this is the last thing here. This is what I call the get lucky camera. In this case, the cyclist is riding. If you're a little squeamish, there's nothing bloody here, but it's interesting. This guy behind the cyclist got a dash cam for his birthday, and this is his first time using it, and bam, oops, and the little beetle runs the red light and hits the cyclist. Cyclist does a complete flip in the air and lands basically on his feet. Here he goes. Cyclist has the right of way here, and the motorist comes through the stop sign, doesn't see the cyclist and hits him. And again, this is one of those get lucky cameras where it just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, the cyclist was, but fortunately we had very graphic evidence to show what happened and how it was he suffered the very severe injuries that he did on his legs. So if you ever read H.G. Wells, he wrote a piece called Utopia. And in that piece, he said, when I see an adult on a bicycle, I do not despair for the future of the human race. And those of us in the bicycle advocacy community, I think, would agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Wells. So thank you very much. That's what I have.